to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales and to our first event for 2022. Our speaker tonight is Richard Mathews. Richard is convener of Diplomats for Climate Action Now, a group formed in September 2021 to bring together former diplomats and development and other officials who were concerned about Australia's need to have a more urgent and a more active climate change policy. Richard himself served 30 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with postings to Brunei Darussalam, Greece and Taiwan, and most recently he was Australia's first Consul General in Makassar in Indonesia. He's also managed diverse areas in DFAT, including nuclear policy, services trade, relations with Southern Europe, relations with India and surrounding countries, and he's fluent in Indonesian. Richard will speak to us for half an hour, and we'll then have half an hour for questions, both from the floor here at Glover Cottages and online. Please indicate to our using the question and answer function on the Zoom screen if you'd like to ask a question, and that will be coordinated by our question coordinator. So thank you all very much for joining us, and it's over to Richard Mathews.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honour to be here at the Australian Institute for International Affairs, New South Wales, and especially to be the first speaker for the year on the AIIA's New South Wales speaker program. It's a lovely venue as well. I can let all those online know that the Glover Cottages in Miller Point are extremely well located and very beautiful. So it's very, very happy for us, very happy for my wife and I to be able to come tonight. On the 8th of December last year, our group, Diplomats for Climate Action Now, published a full-page advertisement in the Australian newspaper titled "A Climate-Focused Foreign Policy for Australia." It was publicly supported by over 90 former Australian ambassadors, high commissioners, consuls general, diplomats, trade and development officers. This document called on Australia to adopt a new foreign trade and development policy to meet the challenge of climate change. It expressed our grave concerns about the urgent need to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions and highlighted how our current low level of action on climate change is harming Australia's international credibility, harming our long-term national security interests and undermining our future economic prosperity. Our advertisement also emphasised that if we take positive action now and raise our ambitions in decarbonising the economy, it will, and I quote, open significant economic employment opportunities for Australians to provide the world with low-carbon commodity and manufactured exports, and secure our reputation as a forward-leaning, reliable international partner with our major allies as well as our neighbours in Asia and the Indo-Pacific. The paper then provided a menu of over 20 key elements that we saw as important parts of a climate-focused foreign policy for Australia. These elements included a call for Australia to affirm in legislation a commitment to achieving net zero emissions at the latest by 2050, commit to strong nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, at least halving emissions by 2030, ban new fossil fuel projects, end coal-fired electricity generation and coal mining by 2035, phase out the use of fossil fuels and transition the economy to renewables as soon as possible, join global efforts to reduce methane, nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas emissions as well as CO2, affirm in legislation the commitment to end deforestation by 2030, to strengthen nature-positive policies and programs and support nature-based greenhouse gas abatement, and support developing country partners in Southeast Asia and the Pacific to also reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and transition their economies. We also said that during 2022, Australia should double its allocation of green climate finance and recommit to the UN Green Climate Fund, and Australia should champion the interests of small island states via the Green Climate Fund. Australia should also commit to supporting vulnerable Pacific Island nations with a safe refuge resettlement program for affected populations if or when their homelands became no longer habitable due to sea level rise or other effects of climate change. These are all highly aspirational demands, of course, but with the right will and leadership, they are not impossible to achieve. For those of us who are deeply concerned about climate change, these are core requirements for Australia's contribution towards ensuring that we have a world that is still habitable by our grandchildren. Our group, Diplomats for Climate Action Now, regard these commitments as the bare minimum required to repair Australia's international reputation in global climate negotiations. I have no background in DFAT as a climate negotiator, nor have I worked on climate issues in Canberra. In fact, like many DFAT officers in the 1990s, I worked diligently to promote Australia's exports of so-called clean coal, especially to our fast-developing Asian partners. Later in the 2000s, when I was posted to Taipei, I promoted exports of our bountiful so-called clean gas, believing that at least our gas and coal were cleaner than that exported by some of our competitors. So we were doing the right thing, weren't we? But in the 2000s and 2010s, I also began to realise that climate change was a real issue, one that threatened the continued habitability of the planet. From 2016, during my posting as the first Consul General in Makassar covering eastern Indonesia, I saw how climate change was threatening the futures of tens of millions of people living just to Australia's north. Makassar was a dream posting, as I got to travel around some of the world's most beautiful tropical islands, studying cultures that had been prospering for thousands of years and observing a part of the world famous for its natural biodiversity. Indonesia sits across the equator, connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and I realised that the islands of eastern Indonesia face the same threats as the islands of the Pacific Ocean. Since the 1990s, many Pacific nations have expressed great concern about climate change, fearing that sea level rise and extreme weather events threaten their very existence. During my posting to Makassar, I also witnessed how uncontrolled and unsustainable development was threatening the beautiful islands of eastern Indonesia. Marine plastic pollution is a major problem, and indeed Indonesia is second only to China as a source of marine plastic waste. These island communities were also struggling with unreliable electricity supplies, supplied from generators running on expensive and polluting diesel fuel. In 2016, at the start of my posting, very few political leaders in Indonesia were talking about these problems. Indonesia, however, is rich in renewable and energy resources. Renewable energy power systems could eliminate the costs of importing expensive diesel fuel into isolated island communities. But there was no Indonesian government support for regional or community renewable energy programs, nor did any component of Australia's development assistance program to Indonesia focus on renewables. I decided to focus my Consul General's small development assistance program on supporting renewable energy for island communities and promoting activities such as sustainable tourism in these islands. Disappointingly, but not surprisingly, I got no support for my programs from our department in Canberra and limited help from the embassy in Jakarta. But at least they left me alone. I organised a renewable energy seminar in Makassar in 2019, a renewable energy training course under the Australia Awards program for Indonesian experts and people from the private and non-government sector, and local seminars and activities to promote biogas projects for farmers, novel ways to harness solar energy for local needs, and programs to reduce plastic pollution. I retired in February 2021. That's just over it's a year since I retired. And when I retired, I felt free to focus on my concerns about climate change and the urgency of transitioning to a renewable energy-based economy. I went through a phase that many of us go to when we make a commitment to work for a better climate outcome. At our home in Canberra, for example, I installed solar panels and replaced our gas heating system with an electric reverse cycle system, and then I installed a Tesla battery, and now we hardly buy any electricity from the roof. So, I did all of that and thought I was doing a great thing, and certainly it's a great thing to do if you can afford it. It's not cheap. It's not expensive though. We haven't yet bought an electric car, but that's the plan for the future. But more importantly, I established our group, Diplomats for Climate Action Now. It began in September 2021, as Ian mentioned. At that time, I decided to write a letter to the PM and senior cabinet ministers calling for Australia to commit to net zero emissions before 2050 and stronger emission reduction commitments before 2030, in advance of the Glasgow COP26 meeting in November. I put out a call for support from other former diplomats via social media, LinkedIn and so forth, and soon I had a dozen or so committed supporters. Then a week later, another 20 had contacted me to say they would sign the letter. Then on the weekend, you might recall when the National Party held their conflab to decide on net zero emissions by 2050, I had 70 former diplomats signed on, and I released the letter. The timing was perfect. Media interest was high because of what was happening in the National Party. I was interviewed by Channel 7, Wind TV, and reports of our letter were picked up by all the major papers. I was somewhat taken aback, but certainly surprised and certainly pleased by the level of support from my former colleagues. I had tapped into a growing sense of unease among many of our former colleagues that for too long Australia has sat back and ignored this problem. Indeed, many would argue that Australia has been a climate laggard for much of the time since the start of global climate negotiations in the 1990s. Now, my colleagues who are experts in the climate negotiations can correct me on this, because I know that we have done some good things in climate negotiations, but by and large, Australia has been regarded as a climate laggard since the Rio summit in 1992. Our former diplomats group now has a website and a standing committee and over 100 members. We have 4 streams of work. We're seeking meetings with political leaders from both major parties and independents to promote our climate-focused foreign policy for Australia. We're working with like-minded groups, for example, the group led by Greg Mullins, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. We're working with a few other groups like Veterinarians for Climate Action to develop joint actions on climate in the lead up to the election. And we're encouraging all our members to write to their local MPs and senators to demand stronger action on climate change and to adopt our climate-focused foreign policy principles. And a subgroup of our members, including former heads of mission to the Pacific and diplomats who've worked in the Pacific, are developing a paper on the importance of Australia taking serious action to support our Pacific family in the face of rising sea levels and more extreme weather events. Our group is a diverse group with members from all political leanings. We've tried studiously not to criticise the government, rather to point out what we see as urgent policy directions. We have urged change in our foreign policy and called for Australia to take a leadership role on climate action. This has appealed to many of our older members who remember a time when Australia's diplomats were admired for their activism on the world stage on issues from the law of the sea to chemical weapons, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to APEC, to the Antarctic Treaty, and so forth. All of us in Diplomats for Climate Action Now very much wish to see Australia regain its role as a respected middle power, a force for good in international affairs. And we could do that if we seriously tackled the key existential threat facing humanity in the 21st century, which is climate change. But sadly, no Australian government has covered itself in glory since the Rio meeting of 1992. So the question is, we want this to happen. How can we become a global leader on climate action? The first step in regaining our international credibility as a middle power is to get our domestic climate policies in order. We cannot expect to be taken seriously in the world if we refuse to get on board with the unstoppable global trend to eliminating greenhouse gas emissions as rapidly as possible and decarbonising our economies. It's not as if we don't know what we need to do to face up to climate change. The science is robust and accepted by all the world's scientists, most of the world's governments, and we all know that if we do not reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, global warming will accelerate and by the end of this century make life on Earth a whole lot worse than it is now. Every new IPCC report simply serves to strengthen the data and increase our sense of urgency. Yet as a global community, we are still moving very slowly to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and to transition our economies to renewables. In Australia, we know what we need to do. Indeed, every state and territory government has a climate change plan and is rapidly promoting and supporting development of renewable energy zones. All of them have accepted the urgency of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, and most have committed to reducing emissions by 50% by 2030. Almost all banks and financial institutions, including most of our superannuation funds, have begun to implement sustainability and responsible investment plans. Shareholders are demanding an exit from investments in fossil fuels and a rapid move into investing in renewables. So much of the private sector, all our state governments are on board. Only our federal leaders have lost the plot on this issue, and why is that? The answer is to do with electoral politics at the federal level and political donations. Firstly, jobs are at stake as the energy transition takes hold. Some 40,000 people are directly employed in the coal sector, mostly in the federal electorates, key federal electorates in rural New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. Coal and gas are also major exports for Australia, and to wean ourselves off this dependency will require significant planning and government resources. Second, both sides of federal politics are highly dependent on significant donations from the fossil fuel sector. A recent study by the Australian Conservation Foundation found that coal, oil and gas sector donations accounted for over half of all publicly acknowledged political donations to the major parties since 2015-16. However, some 2/3 of political donations are so-called dark money, money that does not need to be accounted for under our lax federal political donation laws. The ACF study also found that from 2015 to 2019, the major parties had close to $283 million in income from undisclosed sources. Money buys influence and access in politics, and the fossil fuel sector has no problem with that. But the irony is that Australia is incredibly rich in renewable energy resources. And the best sun and wind power centres are in the very conservative electorates that our major political parties are focused on. Barnaby Joyce's electorate, for example, is in the centre of what the New South Wales government has designated as the New England Renewable Energy Zone. There are several renewable energy zones around the state, including in the Hunter Valley. Renewable energy zones are, as the New South Wales government describes them, modern-day power stations, coordinating solar, wind and other renewable energy resources with high-voltage power lines and battery storage. The New England Renewable Energy Zone alone will supply up to 8 gigawatts of new power for the state. As Professor Ross Garnaut has demonstrated, Australia has the potential to become a renewable energy superpower, exporting significant quantities of renewable energy as electricity or green hydrogen or green ammonia. And two of Australia's most innovative billionaires, Andrew Forrest and Mike Cannon-Brookes, have teamed up to build Sun Cable, a massive renewable energy project in northern Australia which aims to supply up to 15% of Singapore's electricity needs by undersea cable by 2027. There is no doubt that Australia has the capacity to become a regional renewable energy superpower. We can make the transition to renewable energy and green industrial processes more easily than most nations. and this transition will result in many new and permanent jobs and a strong 21st century economy. One of the facts of globalization is that we cannot close our borders to climate change, nor can we ignore the fact that what we do in our own backyard today matters to other nations. Therefore, I'll say this again, we must get our domestic climate change policies right first if we are to repair our international standing on climate change. For too long, we've been seen as the climate laggard, and our international credibility is in the balance. No matter how far we advance in developing our own renewable energy sector at the state government level, we will not be taken seriously in climate negotiations until our federal government shows a genuine commitment to reducing CO2 emissions as rapidly as possible and accepts publicly that Australia must phase out fossil fuels in the energy sector and progressively replace our coal, oil and gas mining sectors with clean, green energy and industrial processes. Failing to act decisively on climate change defers inevitable actions and imposes greater costs on future Australians. Failing to act will jeopardise our exports as other countries apply carbon border taxes or refuse to import our carbon-intensive products. Failing to act will jeopardise foreign investment and the ability of Australian companies to secure international finance as investors and financial institutions refuse to take on the high risks of financing carbon-intensive projects. And failing to act will jeopardise our national security as allies and neighbours turn elsewhere for support in mitigating their own climate risk, and as our credibility as a negotiating partner diminishes. However, if we take decisive action on climate change and show leadership in our bilateral and regional relationships and international fora, we have a lot to gain. Indonesia, for example, with a population of over 265 million, has a target of net zero emissions by 2060, but it will need a lot of international assistance to get there, investment, technical assistance, so forth, and it's made that very clear. Indeed, back in February 2019, President Joko Widodo visited Australia and addressed a joint sitting of Parliament, and in his speech he invited Australia to help Indonesia to achieve its climate goals. He invited us, and I quote, to protect the environment, to achieve sustainable development and reforestation in forest and river upstream areas, to prevent forest and land fires, to commit to lowering carbon emissions and to develop renewable energy and other green technologies. Of course, COVID hit both countries a few weeks later, so that invitation's been forgotten. But here's a great opportunity for Australia. We can develop a much stronger future by working with Indonesia in renewable energy and decarbonising the economy. And we should refocus our development assistance programs with Indonesia to prioritise climate change, adaptation and mitigation. All of us in Diplomats for Climate Action now believe that Australia has a special relationship with our Pacific neighbours. There is mutual warmth and understanding between the people of Australia and the Pacific, and many Pacific Islander communities have settled happily in Australia. But many Pacific Island governments are very disappointed and frustrated with Australia because for far too long, Australian governments have failed to seriously address the issue which poses the gravest existential threat to the future viability of the Pacific states. Australia still refuses to commit to stronger greenhouse gas emission targets and to phasing out fossil fuel industries. Our governments have consistently refused to endorse strong pro-climate language in Pacific regional meetings and communiques and at international meetings such as the COPs, the recent COP in Glasgow. This has made Australian governments hard to like and hard to trust. Finally, maybe I'll conclude now with a few ideas of the future. I think the more I think about climate change, the more I'm convinced that not only can Australia become a global leader on climate action, but it's essential that we do so if we are to survive the climate crisis, both as a nation and as a global community. If Australia takes a leadership role on climate action, it will help accelerate the pathway for other nations towards net zero emissions. We could, for example, be the first major energy exporting nation to make serious emission reduction commitments and to implement them. We could be the first energy exporting nation to rapidly convert our economy to renewables. This would encourage other governments and communities to take seriously their commitments. Implementation of IPCC commitments is not going to be easy for anyone. But if Australia were to act fast, show it is possible, and that it raises living standards, which it will, our example would have a significant mobilising and accelerating effect on the global climate action. The economic benefits which would flow to our economy, our workers and our businesses from a rapid transition to renewable energy and green industrial processes would encourage other national efforts. This is because we can do it. We have the renewable resources. We have the technological capacity, and at least among the general population and the state governments, we have the will. So at present, the first key step is for the federal government to fix up its domestic climate policies. Whichever government wins the election has to implement much stronger climate policies, commit to much greater emission reductions by 2030, stop funding new fossil fuel projects, remove fossil fuel sector subsidies and redirect them into renewables, accelerate the transition to renewables and green industrial processes, help regional fossil fuel workforces transition to new renewable and other industries, implement stronger nature protection laws, reforest large parts of the country, adopt greener agricultural policies, support our neighbours in Asia and the Pacific to decarbonise their economies and achieve their energy transitions, export our plentiful solar and wind power as electricity, green hydrogen or green ammonia. The list goes on. As I've already said, we cannot close our borders to climate change, nor can we ignore the fact that what we do in our own backyard matters to others. We all want to leave behind a habitable planet for our children and grandchildren. To do this, Australia must get its domestic climate policies in order and take a global leadership role on climate action. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Richard. That's very interesting indeed. We now have half an hour for questions, both from the floor here, in which case you should scamper over and get a microphone and then address your question, or our online listeners. And I think we've probably got one or two ready to go. Okay, Tom, the first online question. Are you fine with coming?
So our first online question is from Michelle Smith, and the question is directed to Climate Action Now. Should we be more ambitious when we advocate for targets?
Well, that's one of the key points I'm making, is that I think for Australia to repair its international credibility, we do have to improve our targets that we've committed to. And in our policy, climate-focused foreign policy for Australia, we're recommending Australia commit to at least reducing its target for 2030 to 50%. I mean, that's about the standard that's being adopted by our like-mindeds around the world, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 50% by 2030. As I said, to get our house in order, we've got to get domestic policies right first, and we have to be as ambitious as possible. I mean, many other organisations have come up with different proposals. There are some saying that we have to reduce by 75% by 2030 if we're going to keep warming below a certain level. There are all sorts of targets that are floating around, but the main thing is that whichever party wins the next election must come up with much stronger and more rapid greenhouse gas emission reduction targets.
Who do we have now? Anyone here on the floor? How about online?
Yep. We've got an online question from Melissa Conley-Tyler. Thank you for stating the vision of Australia as a renewable energy superpower so clearly. The Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue has just released a paper on how Australia can play on this role in Southeast Asia as part of the region's green energy transition. Who do you think will be the most important actors in making this happen?
Thanks, Melissa, for that question. And I you've let me know about the AP4D report, which sounds very interesting. Who will be the most important actors? Well, I'm assuming you mean which nations will be the most important actors. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, I'll take it generally. I think certainly the major emitters in our region, China, the Northeast Asian countries, Indonesia will be a significant partner. I think if Indonesia can get it right, then it will be able to show other developing countries the pathway to decarbonising and transitioning towards a renewable energy economy. It's not easy. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of courage, and it's going to take a lot of investment. But and in that, the private sector is going to be obviously the major actor, and there's a lot of excitement amongst some investors in the private sector, especially when you see Andrew Forrest and his project to develop this massive idea of turning parts of outback Northern Territory into a huge solar power plant and then exporting the electricity overseas. These are quite visionary ideas, and by all accounts they're very realistic. So there's a whole range of people that are key actors. But for Australia's point of view, I think that we really need the federal government to get on board and make a real effort to take this vision on board and transition our economy, set up all the systems and the regulations required to facilitate the transition. And that includes helping the fossil fuel sector as it's going to decline, helping workers in the fossil fuel sector to transition as well. And the workers in the fossil fuel sector know they have to transition. They're asking for help and assistance in places like the La Trobe.
Redeeming our international reputation would be more or less impossible.
A point of no return? I don't think so. I think, we can always reform, we can always do better. Certainly, that argument, I don't think it would take long for us to redeem ourselves, so to speak, if it did have an about turn in our foreign policy. I mean, our group is advocating it through our climate-focused foreign policy for a whole menu of options, and we realise that it's not as if the government's going to turn around and say, "Oh, okay, we'll adopt all of them from tomorrow," but it's a process, and we think that we can influence policy making through putting out statements like this, like the climate-focused foreign policy, which you can find on our website. And over time, that will hopefully influence policy making in Australia. It's certainly taken the interest of some of the independents, for example. The independents that are standing this year in the election are very climate-focused, as well as they have a lot of other issues they're focused on, but they're certainly very focused on the climate. So, we think that putting forward a policy like this will help influence policy making in the future. And I think that our public servants, for example, our agencies, are very well equipped to make an about turn on climate change. I mean, I'm absolutely confident that most of our colleagues still serving in DFAT, for example, would be really excited by the idea of adopting much stronger climate commitments and then going forth in the world and promoting them, and then trying to develop relationships with our partners in the region to transform their economies and to work together in the transformation of our economy and their economies into this new paradigm where we've decarbonised and we run everything on renewable energy, green hydrogen, green ammonia and so forth, green concrete and all those things. It's all very possible.
Next question.
Yep, this question is from Philippa Rowland. The question is, how can we leverage off private investors like the Singapore Sun Cable to connect our renewable energy expertise with countries requiring investment and expertise, for example, in the Pacific? And thank you for providing a wonderful overview and path ahead for a positive plan to improve our international credibility by acting swiftly on domestic policies.
How can we leverage off private investors? Is that the question? Yeah. Well, as I said, there's a lot of interest from the private sector to invest in renewables. The New South Wales renewable energy zones, I read that I think the New England zone was oversubscribed once they opened it up for investment proposals. There's a lot of expertise in Australia in the renewable sector. For example, I've heard you may know that over a quarter of all residential households in Australia have installed solar PV, including myself. I think that somebody said the other day it's gone up to about a third of all residential houses. We've got a lot of people and companies in Australia that have got that expertise now in installing solar PV. That's an expertise that, if we did it right, could be transferred either through training and technical training, or our companies that invest in that sector might be able to start working in our regional partners. There's huge opportunities to work together in renewable. In one particular weakness in many of our regional countries, for example, is the grid, the national grid network. And integrating renewables into the network is not an easy thing. I'm no expert on it, but I know it's very complex and quite technical. But we're doing it. I mean, South Australia's managed to overcome its problems with a few years ago. They're running often on close to 100% renewable, but they haven't had power cuts. They've managed to integrate battery and other storage technologies into their system. We've got that technical knowledge and technical expertise, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to share it to mutual benefit with our regional partners.
Chris Skinner, member of Council of AIIA New South Wales. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. You talked a lot about decarbonisation, removal of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, but all plants depend on CO2 as one of the constituents that they need to thrive. What's your view on things like agricultural effects and, in particular, deforestation, especially perhaps in Indonesia?
Yeah, well, this is a very political question. Deforestation is a key problem in reducing our CO2 emissions, because, of course, forests are natural carbon sinks, and the more trees you chop down, the harder it is going to be for us to achieve our emission reduction targets. Deforestation in Indonesia, well, the Indonesian government committed to the pledge on deforestation, ending deforestation by 2030, I believe, at COP26. But, it's a very hot political issue in Indonesia too, because one of the major export industries in Indonesia is the palm oil industry, where they've replaced a lot of their forests with palm oil plantations. So certainly it's a touchy political issue for Indonesia. In Australia, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe we've achieved a sort of peak deforestation now. Hopefully it won't, we'll start reversing that. The issue of decarbonisation is a very technical one, and there's lots of literature you can read about this. But it now has in the past it was something that people weren't quite sure about, didn't know how on earth we could go about it. But now it's becoming clearer and clearer. More and more scientific experts and business people are getting together and working out new ways to produce the goods we need today from processes that don't rely upon fossil fuels as an input. So there are people in our economy, in our business, private sector, in government too, working out new ways to do all this, and it's all happening, and I believe it's unstoppable, and it certainly is happening around the world, and certainly in Europe. And I think that decarbonisation is effectively, in other words, removing introducing industrial processes which do not emit carbon dioxide, or finding ways to remove the carbon dioxide emissions from those processes. That decarbonisation process is happening, and it's going to happen more and more rapidly around the world. And if we don't if we don't adopt the right policies, Australia will be left behind in this new 21st century economy.
Next question is online. No, next question is here in the audience.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm Drew, I'm one of the interns here. I guess my question is looking at the role of, you talked about political donations and dark money and how that's come to influence policy making in Australia, looking back at the overthrow of Rudd back in 2010 with the mining super profits tax, the proposed mining super profits tax, the overthrow of the Gillard government with the carbon tax, and then even more recently looking at the COP26 set up and having Santos, the natural gas company, being a key sponsor of Australia's position at a climate conference. How do you see the Australian government being able to overcome corporate interest in order to lead on climate action?
That's a good question. I think it requires a lot of pressure from the community, from advocacy groups, and there are a lot of advocacy groups around there which are looking specifically at these issues of political donations, and especially donations from the fossil fuel sector, because as long as our politicians, our political leaders, are receiving political donations, undisclosed political donations from these fossil fuel companies, they will have excellent and unfettered access, and they will be able to influence policy much more effectively than we can by putting out a joint statement on climate-focused foreign policy. I mean, money talks. Obviously, when you're in Parliament and you need money to get elected, money talks. So we need more openness, more transparency, and there's quite a lot of activity out there in the community to demand greater transparency, and there are groups like, for example, Market Forces, which is always looking at the where the money goes and so forth. And so it's, in a sense, I think there's a lot of optimism that we can actually do it. We can actually clean up the system, and certainly there are, that's one of the platforms that many of the independents are focusing on in this election, the independent candidates, as well as climate change. They want a more transparent and open system to make it clear where all these political donations are coming from.
Hey, so I'm Victor, one of the interns at AIA. So my question is that in your advocacy work, you've advocated for a rather progressive agenda, and that's in contrast to the current government, which is rather conservative. So I just want to ask, in your advocacy, why did you choose this approach and not, in some other people's eyes, argue for a more conservative agenda that might be implemented in the current government?
Well, I mean, we're getting very political here, but I might say that our approach is regarded probably by most climate action groups as very, very conservative. I mean, we are a bunch of former conservatively minded diplomats, and when you think about the people in our group who are mostly retirees, we've got a lot of younger diplomats who've moved on to other careers as well, but most of the more senior, older members of our group are very conservative and very opposed to change, but they've accepted these ideas that we need to, get our domestic climate policies in order first. Now, how do I think that our approach, which you think is quite radical, which I don't think is radical at all, do you think that it will influence our current Conservative government? All I can say is we hope so. We know that, for example, in the Liberal National Party, there are a lot of moderates who are very conscious of climate change and would like to see much stronger government commitments to reducing emissions and to assisting fossil fuel communities, coal and oil and gas communities, worker communities, to transition and to promote a rapid transition to renewables and so forth. They want it done carefully and properly and without, taking risks, I guess. But there is that undercurrent of concern amongst Liberal National Party members and voters too. But for too long they've been constrained by a leadership which has refused to act seriously on climate change. Now, that's my personal view, okay? I mean, I can't, when it gets into criticising the government, as I said before, our group will not criticise the government. They shy away from that because they want to promote a better understanding of the foreign policy dimensions of not acting seriously on climate change. And the foreign policy dimensions are quite serious. As I said to you, we're losing credibility. We're likely to come under increasing pressure. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was visiting last week as a guest of the Liberal Party, I believe, and she even came out publicly in criticism of Australia's poor climate record. And this is Margaret Thatcher, a figure, a pillar of the conservative political community, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, I mean, we're going to face serious criticism from our partners and allies if we do not get on board and start committing to phasing out fossil fuels and stronger emission reduction commitments. So, that's the concerns that most of our members have.
Thanks so much for your talk, Richard. I'm Alex. I'm one of the councillors at AAA in New South Wales. I appreciate that you weren't directly involved in climate negotiations or things during your career, but I was interested in something you said in your talk around a kind of legacy within Australian diplomacy about kind of raising international standards on issues like whaling and the Antarctic. I'm wondering, one of the criticisms that's often levelled at kind of international climate negotiations and things is that they very much play to the lowest common denominator. If you're a kind of nation that's really embedded in fossil fuels, you can just kind of block and block and block and block, and eventually you'll wear people down. I'm wondering if you could speak to how you actually raise ambition in kind of international negotiations or diplomacy, maybe drawing from other things that you were involved in during your time as a diplomat.
Well, you're correct. I've never been involved in climate negotiations. I've been concerned about climate for a long time, but I do think things are changing. I think levels of ambition have increased, and we saw that at COP26 with most of the G7, most of the G20, except for Australia and maybe a few others, making much stronger commitments to reduce emissions by 2030. And I think that certainly in the EU and increasingly in the United States now with the Biden administration, the determination to try and do as much as possible to resolve the climate emergency, to avoid a climate crisis, is increasing. And so I do think the level of ambition internationally is rising, and Australia's being left behind if we don't also increase our levels of ambition. And as I argued in my speech, I believe not only do we need to keep up with the rest of the world, but I think we can be we should be a global leader in climate action, because if a country like Australia can take radical and swift moves towards decarbonising the economy and phasing out fossil fuels and reducing emissions, then we will have a major impact on the world. Often we're criticised for, whinging effectively about climate change because Australia only produces 1% of the world's emissions. Well, that's not a very strong argument. The reality is that we are one of the highest per capita CO2 emitters in the world, and also we're a major exporter of high carbon content energy, coal, oil and gas. And so if we can take a leading role in giving an example to the rest of the world, it will help encourage this increased level of ambition throughout the world, and it will help accelerate the global transition to a renewable, clean, green economy.
Chris Skinner again, and what may be one from left field, and so I'm just giving you a heads up. The accepted wisdoms coming out of the OECD and other places is that to adopt renewable energy is by far the best approach, but it's unlikely and maybe not feasible to achieve 100% renewables. If your objective is to decarbonise, that is to remove emissions which cause global warming, then would you accept that nuclear power should be considered as a possible addition to renewables?
Thanks, Bruce. Nuclear power. Well, I think there are many amongst our group of diplomats who would certainly favour nuclear power. There are some who would strongly oppose it too. And I mean, in Australia, we've taken a decision long ago not to adopt nuclear power, but in some parts of the world, it's a successful. You know, in France, for example, the majority of electricity is produced by nuclear power stations. But then again, you know, we saw the horrific disaster that happened when the tsunami. The Fukushima tsunami destroyed the nuclear power plants there. So it's a tricky area to work in. But you know, this is the issue. Do we place our hopes in a technology that we know is risky, and we hope will become safer over time? I mean, there are new types of nuclear power plants coming out now, you know, which are supposedly safer. Pebble bed nuclear reactors and stuff like that. I'm not sure, I'm not a technical expert in that area. There's also some people advocating, you know, the great energy source for the future will be fusion power. But we can't hang around and wait for these things. We need to act now. The urgency is now. If you take all the information coming out of the IPCC, you know, since I've got into this business, I've been reading voraciously lots of books about climate change. There's an industry out there. It's almost, you know, an industry of climate porn, you might say. The 6 degrees of warming and so forth. What it's going to do to the world and this sort of. It's quite frightening, quite worrying when you read all this stuff. But if we take it seriously, the conclusion is we have to act now. And so. My feeling is we can't wait around for some new technology to come and save us. And I'd also take issue with the argument that we can't supply our electricity 100% from renewables. Well, we can. With adequate storage and network coordination and grid management, we can. And South Australia is getting towards that. And there are some countries in the world which have achieved. I mean, Tasmania is 100% renewable, for example. Sorry, not a country, but a state of Australia. Tasmania has been 100% renewable for a long time. Of course, it's relying on legacy hydropower, but it exports electricity to the Victorian mainland. And there are some countries in the world which have achieved 100% renewable. And you know, I think that. As far as from what I've read, it's quite feasible, Bruce, to have a reliable, well-managed national power system that runs on renewables with battery and other storage that enables you to provide power during periods when there's no sun or little wind or the rivers are running dry. So, you know, that's the technology we have now. And that's the technology we can adopt. It's also the cheapest technology that's available at the moment. You know, nuclear power is very expensive, has very long lead time, and has very expensive after costs. You know, cleaning up and decommissioning nuclear power plants is very expensive. So, you know, why place your faith in those sorts of technologies when we have it right in front of us? You know, solar, wind, hydro, even geothermal. And other forms of renewable, which you may know about.
We probably have time for one last question. Is there something online?
Nothing online, but I have my own question. You mentioned during your talk that as Consul General you had discretion over, I think it was the development funding, and you were able to direct that to renewable energy. Is that something that all Consul Generals have in DFAT? And what would be the consequence of a coordinated approach to that? Or like, what is the impact of that autonomy across the world?
Well, every head of mission or head of post has especially in developing countries, has a small development assistance program budget, or DAP we call it, and you can spend that on in the form of grants. And in Indonesia, we would offer grants of between $10,000 to $15,000 per project, which we would deliver through NGOs, and it was all very well managed and accounted for, and met all the right financial requirements and so forth. We'd put out a call for expressions of interest, and we'd have a number of proposals put forward, and then we'd go through them carefully, and we'd help them modify their projects if we saw they were a bit, needed a bit of help. But yeah, I was able to do it because, Eastern Indonesia, it's a bit out of the way, and Canberra's not all that interested in it. They just wanted me to open up a consulate general in Eastern Indonesia, and that was it. It's a political statement for Indonesia. But I mean, I'm being a bit cynical there. But the reality was, I was able to use my discretion on how to spend it. And my colleagues in Bali, she was interested in some of those types of programs as well. And the embassy was interested too, but they couldn't become too high profile in what they were doing, because at the time, of course, the political atmosphere, and perhaps even today, wasn't, or less so today, but the political atmosphere wasn't very favourable towards us doing programs which acknowledged the existence of climate change in that way. I mean, it was very difficult it would be very difficult back then to get a major renewable energy program up and running under the development assistance program agreements with Indonesia. But I'm hopeful that even under this current government, it's going to become much easier to actually move money into those areas, because the demand is there for sure from Indonesia, and increasingly our governments they've recognised the need for net zero emissions by 2050, so that's a real plus in terms of attitude change. So I think over time, we'll see more and more of our development funding moving into climate-focused activities.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Richard. Let me just say that a big thank you to you all for joining us tonight, both our people here in the physical audience, only a small number under current COVID restrictions, and those of you online who, though invisible, have been by no means inaudible. Thank you very much for your questions and your contribution to such an interesting evening.